Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trauma Informed Church Kid podcast. Today and every day, we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. And today, this is another one of my expertise episodes. So I have on here someone who I have been reading a lot for quite a while and also enjoyed immensely. This is Sheila Gregoire. And I just wanted to introduce her to everybody and say hello and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk to you today.
Awesome. Yeah, I very much am. As I said, I have found your books to be incredibly helpful for me as a millennial who grew up in purity culture and also now as a father of a daughter. And so this has
Mm,
been
mhm,
quite instructive.
mhm. How old is she?
She has just turned 9.
Okay, so
Mhm.
getting into that age, yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
indeed. It, yes, very much yes. So I
Mhm.
wanted to see, obviously I'm quite familiar with your work, but I wanted to see if you could introduce yourself to everybody else and to just give a brief high-level summary of your work that you've done.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Sheila Wray Gregoire. I'm the founder of Bare Marriage, and I started out as one of these typical evangelical mommy bloggers back in 2008. So I was in that space, and I was writing about marriage and parenting. And the more I talked about sex, the more my traffic grew. So I kind of became this Christian sex lady, which is weird, right? And I wrote a number of pretty big books about sex in the aughts or in the teens. I don't even know what you call them, like the 2010s,
Okay.
whatever those years are. And I was in this bubble of evangelical marriage and sex authors, and I was friends with quite a few of them. I've always been an egalitarian, so I've always believed that women and men are equal and that we should run after Jesus together. That my husband is not my mediator with God, but I was in this very complementarian space, and I
Mm,
was kind of
right,
trying to push it a little bit, like, but
right.
not really blatantly. And then everything changed for me in 2019 when I sat down and I read Love and Respect for the first time because I hadn't actually read a lot of other books.
Mhm.
And I had even recommended Love and Respect at marriage conferences because everyone told me it was a great book. And I assumed it was because I thought they love Jesus, we love Jesus, we're all saying the same thing. And I realized, oh crap, we are not saying the same thing. Like this is awful.
Yeah.
And working for me at the time was my oldest daughter, Rebecca, who had just graduated from psychology and had done quite a bit in survey design, and
Mm.
a young woman named Joanna Sawatsky, who had a master's in epidemiology and was a statistician and had written a bunch of academic papers already. And she was home with her baby and wanted something to do, so she was working for me. And I was like, well, we got all the skills here. Let's just do it. So we started doing huge research projects to look at how the teachings in evangelicalism actually affect women's and eventually men's to marital and sexual satisfaction. And that's turned into a bunch of books, a bunch of academic papers, and a lot of controversy. So,
Yes, I can imagine
mhm,
because
mhm,
in your books and in your work, you do take on quite directly multiple sacred cows, both in terms of ideas, but then also in
mhm.
terms of individuals.
Yeah. I've gotten criticized for that a lot. Like people say
Sure,
that's not the kingdom way, right?
sure.
But in the Bible, just read the New Testament. People are always calling out false teachers. And
Hmm.
what does the Bible tell us to do? I mean, what are Jesus's last words to Peter? It's feed my sheep, like care for my sheep. That's what we're supposed to be focusing on, is making sure that people are safe.
Yeah, yes.
And the only way to do that is to warn them who the wolves are, you
Very true.
know?
Yes. That is an awful lot of kind of what I'm trying to do in the podcast as well, is just to really face up to some of the ways in which evangelical culture has caused hurt, caused harm, and just
Hmm.
to admit it, acknowledge it, give voice to the people who have been hurt, and to start a long, long period of repentance from that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned the logistics of getting started in doing that research, but in one of your other interviews, you talked about that kind of shift in like Gen X youth groups to millennial youth groups, and that really
Yeah.
stuck with me. And so I wonder if you could kind of
Hmm.
explain that a little bit.
So I'm in the Canadian context, first of
Okay.
all, which I think is
Okay.
important because,
Yeah. America here. So.
yeah. And so in the 80s, I was in a youth group at a evangelical church in downtown Toronto,
Okay.
extremely multicultural church. And everything we were focused on was like, how are we going to reach the nations for Christ?
Hmm.
So we did a lot of prayer. We did tons of mission focused. You know, we worked through the book Operation World, I think it was, which listed every country in the world. And you know, we would identify if we knew people from those countries and how we can pray for them. Like it was really focused on evangelism, how to tell your testimony, how to reach people for God.
Yeah.
And that's what I grew up in. I did missions trips as a teen and as someone in my early 20s. My husband and I went to missions conferences when we were first married. Like that's really what faith was in that 80s and early 90s.
Hmm.
And when I had my daughters and I sent them to youth group in the late aughts and in early 2010s, I kind of assumed that's what they'd be hearing too, right? Like,
Hmm.
how do we get sold out for Jesus? But something had shifted. And instead, the majority of youth group was focused on purity and purity
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah.
And it's not that we didn't have any of that. Like, we
Hmm.
certainly did have some. Like, there was the expectation that you would date for Jesus, right? And that you would save sex for marriage. But that wasn't the focus of everything we did.
Yeah.
We were very outward focused. And by the 2010s, it had really changed because the way that you were a Christian, the way you showed you were a Christian was by how you did dating and by maintaining your purity. And it was just a very different focus that we now know was very harmful, especially to the girls.
Absolutely. And that's certainly something that I've experienced myself growing up doing True Love Waits conferences and signing
Hmm.
purity pledges and purity rings and reading I Kissed Dating Goodbye and all the other stuff
Yeah.
like that.
And
Yeah,
I don't think everyone realizes what a shift that was. Like, we get the impression that this idea of not kissing till you're married was something which we are now reclaiming from the
Hmm.
Christian past, right? That we are going back to the roots. Are you kidding? Like, that's never been a thing. Okay,
No.
that has never been a thing. Like, heck, even Jane Austen's characters kiss when they get engaged, okay? And
Those hussies.
our grandparents dated like crazy. Like,
Yes.
they would date, my mother would go on a different date with someone on Friday and then different person on Saturday. That was
Hmm.
normal.
Hmm.
And she was in an extremely conservative Mennonite community in her
Hmm.
teens,
Hmm.
right? Like, but that was in the 50s,
Aha.
and just
Yeah.
very, very different. And so this idea that we're going back and we're reclaiming what purity was, no, it was something totally new that had
Hmm.
never been done before.
Yeah, and later on in the conversation, I definitely want to touch on what purity actually is in the Bible.
Hmm.
So I'm going to
Hmm.
stick a pin in that and come back to it. But
Okay.
you mentioned earlier about how you did some research and had
Hmm.
some research specialists and experts in there with you. So what sort of research did you do, and what were some of the kind of broad findings that you discovered?
Yeah. So our first big survey was of 20,000 women,
Okay.
primarily evangelical, and it was for our book, The Great Sex Rescue, which
Hmm.
has been out for 5 years now and has sold, I think, around like almost 150,000 copies. It's really it's been very influential.
Hmm.
Um,
And
Not
highly
my favorite.
recommended, I would say.
My favorite book is still She Deserves Better,
Yes.
but
Yes.
I'm really proud of The Great Sex Rescue.
Yes.
And it's an important book. And in that, we were looking specifically at how teachings around sex affected
Mm-hmm.
women's sexual satisfaction and marital satisfaction. And we had a couple of really big questions, which is, why do evangelical women suffer from sexual pain disorders at twice the rate of the general population? Because we
Mm.
already knew that. That's in the literature. For most in the general population, it's about 7 to 10%. Evangelicals, we found an incidence rate of about 23.
Wow.
So very, very high. Like, what's
Something's
going
wrong.
on? Yeah, something's really wrong.
Mhm.
And we wanted to know about the orgasm gap and we wanted to know how big it was and what we can do about it. So we were looking at that and libido and everything. And wow, our teachings in evangelicalism, which have nothing to do with Jesus, by the way.
Yep.
I want to stress that. Nothing to do with Jesus, but actually are quite harmful. And when Jesus said, and this was kind of our motivating thing, in Matthew 7, that when you're trying to figure out false teaching, and if you look at the context of this, it's trying to figure out like who's right and
Mhm.
what we should believe. He said, you judge the fruit, because a bad tree can't bear good fruit and a good tree can't bear bad fruit. So you'll recognize them by their fruits. And so that's been our motivating thing. It's like, well, let's judge the fruit then, because people have been debating this stuff on theological grounds for so long. And I feel like people are talking past each other. And we didn't want to debate theological grounds. We didn't want to
Mhm.
debate about the meaning of a Greek word or, what the context of this was. We just wanted to say, okay, well, you can believe that if you want, but she's going to have a 37% less orgasm rate, you know?
Yeah. There are real world consequences to our
Yeah.
theology. Yes.
Yeah. And that's what
Yes.
we've done.
Okay. Okay. So one of the things that I have discovered in reading your books is that I honestly don't know exactly how close I read many of these books. So,
Hmm.
like some of the ones you've mentioned, Every Man's Battle, for example,
Hmm.
is one that I was exposed to pretty early on, and not just bad examples. Like I also was, familiar with Boundaries in Dating from Cloud and Townsend and a few others. But I didn't realize just how bad some of these teachings were until I started reading your book. I'm like,
Hmm.
oh wow, like that's actually there. So I had to go back to my copies and say, oh my gosh, it actually was there. So I remember reading those books and just kind of like glossing
Yeah.
over. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering, can you kind of give us a sense, like for those of us like me, perhaps, who didn't really digest some of these teachings in a conscious way? What were some of the
Hmm.
like really bad examples that you came across in your research?
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with Love and Respect,
Okay.
Emerson Eggerichs. So he has a relatively short sex chapter. It is in the section on what wives do for husbands. So sex is not in anything about what husbands do for wives.
Hmm.
And he says, if your husband is typical, he has a need that you don't have. So it starts off saying women don't need sex.
Okay.
He says that men need physical release and women don't. They
Hmm.
need emotional release. Um, he says that if men don't get physical release, they'll come under satanic attack. And most affairs are caused by men not getting physical release.
Hmm.
And um, and he doesn't have a single word in there about intimacy. Not a single word in there about how women should feel pleasure too.
Oh boy.
And that's the number one used book in marriage curriculum in North America.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Hmm.
Another really bad one, Kevin Lehman in sheet music talks
Mm-hmm.
about how if a woman is postpartum or isn't feeling very well or has a really heavy period, so she can't have intercourse,
Hmm.
that's when she can do something that people affectionately call hand jobs
Hmm.
when he's ready to climb the walls. So, and then he also says at a different part in the book that there was a guy who was really struggling with porn, and he found her period was a very difficult time for her husband. Okay, so just pause there.
And
Just think
how does
about,
it feel for her?
yeah,
Just
think about saying to think about a guy saying to
yes.
his wife, "Your period's a difficult time for me." Interesting. Um, and so what she found after a few years was that giving oral sex during her period made things so much easier for him because she realized faithfulness is a two-person job.
Easier for him.
Right. Hmm. Um, Another example, Every Man's Battle
Hmm.
literally called women the methadone for their husband's sex addictions.
Uh, oh my gosh. I remember reading that that was the one actually that made me go, huh? And go back to it.
Hmm.
Because the way you presented it in the book was that there was a guest blogger who was writing on your blog and she
Hmm.
came up with like a
Yeah,
wildly
Rebecca
crazy.
did. Rebecca
Thank you.
did. She was,
Okay.
yeah, she was saying, "What's the worst thing I could possibly say?"
Yes.
And she used that methadone. Yeah,
Yes.
that it's like you are treating women like they're your methadone.
And and then you go to the actual book and you go, oh my gosh, this is a literal example, a
Hmm.
literal language that they use to describe what this is supposed to look like.
Yeah, and they did it twice, so it wasn't just once. It wasn't just a throwaway line. They did it deliberately twice, and they said like, when your husband quits cold turkey, be like a merciful vial of methadone for him and give him release. So again, and so often in these books, sex is described literally as giving your husband release.
And that's so objectifying. Yeah,
Oh
like
gosh, yeah.
not only in the analogy and description to an object, but
Hmm.
then also just purely in reducing the sexual act to release.
Yep. Yep. And and then we wonder, and it never mentions again. Every Man's Battle never mentions that women might have sexual thoughts, that women might enjoy sex. It's just
Hmm.
all about him using her body so that he doesn't lust after anyone else. So it's using her as a masturbatory aid or using her as a sin management tool. It is not anything to do with intimacy.
Okay. So now that we've got the particularly gross stuff out of the way, uh,
Hmm.
this is kind of like laying out baseline of,
Hmm.
of what kind of stuff we might encounter. But
Yep.
you talk about broadly speaking, and this is not a heuristic device that you used in your books, but I've kind of mentally categorized like the core harmful purity teachings in four F's. There's female duty, air
Hmm.
quotes duty,
Yep.
the fragility of male desire,
Hmm.
and then a whole set of fearful sexuality that gets caused because of this. And layered on top of that are a whole different set of like false promises about sex and marriage and flippant fixes that are designed to
Yes.
say, if you just do this, it will solve the problems.
Yes.
And that's the way that I've kind of understood your research. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that's actually really good. I especially, your first one, what was
Hmm.
it? What was it?
Female
Something
duty.
duty,
Female
female
duty.
duty. Yeah,
Hmm.
because that's one thing that we call it the obligation sex message,
Ah, yes.
and we
Hmm.
measured that in our survey, and you know that is probably the most destructive message that we found,
Hmm.
and we identified that as one of the huge reasons for vaginismus, for female sexual pain disorders. In fact, if she believes in obligation sex, if she believes a wife should give her husband sex when he wants it, is obligated to give her husband sex when he wants it, her chance of experiencing sexual pain disorders increases to almost the same statistical effect as if she'd been abused.
Oh my gosh.
So our bodies interpret obligation as trauma because sex is supposed to be a deep knowing, right? Like that's what God
Yeah.
made it for, was a
Yeah.
deep knowing of each other.
Hmm.
And as soon as you turn it into a duty, it's not a knowing, it's an erasing. Because it's saying no matter what you think, no matter what you want, no matter what you feel, you have to do this. And so you actually don't matter. And so how can sex be a knowing if you fundamentally don't matter? And
Mhm.
that is such a dehumanizing message. It's a traumatizing message.
Yes.
And that is one of the big reasons for female sexual pain. It's one of the big reasons for the 47-point orgasm gap that evangelicals have. Yeah, just really, really bad.
Yeah, yeah. And so a big piece of that air quote duty message there is that it's women's responsibility to manage their own sexuality out in public
Mhm,
such that they do not cause their brothers to stumble. So I
mhm.
wonder if you could speak up to some of the research that you found that correlates to that.
Yeah, I mean, we have more of that in our book, She Deserves Better.
Okay.
But because we were looking at it more in the married context in Great Sex Rescue and more in
Hmm.
the purity
Hmm.
culture context in She Deserves Better. But one of the things we did measure in Great Sex Rescue was the belief that that if a wife has sex with her husband, that will help him not watch porn. So she should do it so he doesn't watch porn, which is kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
Like she needs to manage him. So, like I said, she's his sin management tool. She's the
Yeah.
one that reduces the chance
Yeah.
that he'll sin. So it's kind of like Jesus saves women so that women can save men. And that's the way that we see this
Yeah.
because men are
Yeah.
helpless, right?
Yeah.
And that belief again is really toxic as well as simply being untrue. There are so many books that blame women for a husband's porn use.
Hmm.
It's a very, very common thing that is preached from the pulpit. Like, women, you need to be having lots of sex. Don't you know how hard it is for him out there? Shanti Felton has an entire book on this, Through a Man's Eyes, about how hard it is for men out in society. And so we need to be keeping them filled up, so to speak. Or I don't even know what you want to call it, but
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Many disgusting analogies I could use there. Yeah, this idea that if she has enough sex, he won't watch porn is a misunderstanding of both porn and sex because
Hmm.
porn and sex are not substitutes for one another. They're polar opposites,
Correct.
right? Because porn says, I want to use you.
Hmm.
Porn says, I'm focused on my own gratification.
Hmm.
That's not what sex is supposed to be. And the fact that
Correct.
all of these Christian authors and pastors don't even know the difference
Yeah.
is incredibly scary to me.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's an odd sort of pornification of actual,
Hmm.
godly sexual interaction.
Yeah. And that's what's missing from these
Yeah.
books. Like, it just isn't
Yeah.
there. Intimacy is not there. A woman's agency and pleasure is not there. It's
Hmm.
when you look at our best selling books, and that's what we did. We looked at the 15 best selling evangelical sex and marriage books.
Ah.
By and large, it treats sex in a very pornified way. There's no daylight between it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I do want to get into the reconstruction aspect in a second. I'm going to stick another pin in that,
Hmm. Okay. Okay.
because of course that is like really, really important on this podcast, is making sure that we don't
Hmm.
just like problematize everything and tear down everything without giving people something to replace it with.
Yeah.
But you talked about like, men are weak, men can't control
Hmm.
themselves, those kind of things. That's that kind of fragility of male desire aspect of things.
Hmm.
And I've had a really hard time trying to articulate this well. Maybe you can help me here. But I've seen it almost as sort of like a bit of a subtle permission structure for men, because it's every man's battle. Then
Yes.
when it happens, or when failure and sinful acts happen, then it's to be expected, or it's
Hmm.
natural or normal in an odd sort of way that also says everyone's responsible for their own sin, but dot
Hmm.
dot dot. And
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time articulating the problem with that. Can you help me with that?
Yeah, so in Every Man's Battle, they say when it comes to sexual sin among men, we got there naturally simply by being male. And then in another place, they say men just don't have that Christian view of sex. So
Mm.
what they're basically saying is that God created men to objectify women. And the goal is to objectify just one woman. So,
Okay.
but men's sexuality is inherently objectifying. And so to expect men to do anything else is to not understand how God made men. And they actually say that in their book for women, Every Heart Restored, which is supposedly to help women understand men's sex addictions. They share so many stories of women being heartbroken over how their husbands have been acting out. And their reply is always the same. You just need to understand how men are. And you need to show up for him, and you need to give him all these bowls of sexual gratification so that he doesn't desire anything. Like, I don't even know what a bowl of sexual gratification is. Like, that's just so gross, but
That is, yeah.
you know. And so I think you're exactly right in that by phrasing it as every man's battle, even though the book is supposedly about how to get over lust problems, it's actually giving men permission to still have those problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
By making this into every man's battle, by making this into something, this is just the way men are made, it's essentially objectifying all women, because the
Yeah.
solution that they give is to bounce your eyes,
Mm.
right? So either we lust after a woman or we don't look at her. But her identity doesn't change. Her identity as a sexual object doesn't change.
Yeah.
The only difference is what he does. And it's so ridiculous because Jesus didn't refuse to look at women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Jesus chose to truly see women.
Yes. And so one of the things you have highlighted is the difference between looking and lust. And I want to I want to kind of pull that apart a little bit, because when you were talking about that male desire being just part of who we're built in, objectifying it's just kind of who we are, like that doesn't sound good or healthy or pleasant. And so when you talk about the harm of purity culture teachings, like this is not just on women. I mean, obviously
Right.
they primarily, as in many things, bear a lot of the unnecessary burden of that.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, though, like I remember myself as a man, especially a man who early on struggled with pornography and struggled with those kind of desires of trying to understand, well, what am I supposed to do? Because am I supposed to not notice women? Like
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what I'm supposed to do here.
Yeah. So what did Jesus actually say? Okay, Jesus said whoever looks at a woman with lust
Mm,
has already committed adultery. He didn't say whoever notices a woman has breasts, whoever
mm,
sees a really beautiful body, whoever, like, looking is a deliberate action, with lust is a deliberate mindset.
mm,
So it's a deliberate action paired with a deliberate mindset. It
mm.
isn't having a bodily reaction. It isn't having, a flash of attraction. None of those things are sin. It's where you choose to spend your focus and your
Yes.
time, etc. And you just think about like a 12, 13-year-old boy in youth group, and his hormones are all over the place. He's starting to get erections without wanting to,
Hmm.
and little Janet has just started wearing a bra, and he notices, and whatever response he has,
Hmm.
and now he
Hmm.
thinks he's sinning because he's been
Right.
told that, and the shame that comes with that,
Absolutely.
because you think, well, I'm not supposed to feel that way, but it's impossible for me not to feel that way.
Right.
And so God is always angry at me. And
Right.
one of the things about sex addictions is that so much of it is fueled by shame. Because
Hmm.
when you masturbate, you feel better about yourself. And so it's a way to relieve feelings of tension, feelings of discomfort. And so the more shame you have, often the more drawn you are to masturbation, and it all fuels itself,
Yes.
And so I think that by giving this really awful discipleship about sexuality, we've actually created a lot of the lust and porn problems in the church.
Yeah.
And a lot of research has found that porn is a much bigger issue for evangelical men. Not that a greater percentage of evangelical men use porn, but that evangelical men have a much harder time quitting it.
Uh-huh.
Like in the secular world, people might watch porn and then go, yeah, I think I'm done with that. It's not helping me. And they'll just stop. Evangelical men don't just stop because it is so paired with shame.
Okay. Well, that's
Mhm.
part of this fearful sexuality component
Yeah.
is like we say in neuroscience, neurons that fire together,
Fired
wired
together or
together.
wired together. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And so you
Mhm.
have this like sex is shameful. And I know it's never that explicit, but that is,
Hmm.
as your research demonstrates, that is the message that is received. And then it gets wired with sexuality, and then that becomes really, really hard to unwire, even
Hmm.
when, especially when you get into a marriage and you're supposed
Yes.
to, have all these things that were always verboten are now okay. And how do you just
Hmm.
flip that deep, deep brain switch is really hard.
Yep. Yeah, and that's what so many couples are experiencing.
Yeah.
And especially with so many young men getting married early too, very young, thinking that marriage is going to cure my porn problems and my lust
Mm,
problems.
mm,
And women get married young too, thinking that this is what I'm supposed to do, and no one's equipped at how to handle this when it
mm.
doesn't work. And it's causing a lot of issues.
It really does.
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
I think we've thoroughly covered the problem.
Okay.
Let's pull that pin out earlier of what
Hmm.
the reconstructive solution would look like. And this is a heuristic you use in the Great Sex Rescue, and I found it
Yes.
incredibly helpful. Your 7 P's of what sex should be biblically.
Yeah, and I do have 7. I've kind of reduced it to 3 because I find
Oh,
it easier to talk about on a podcast. So if
good,
you read the
good.
book, you'll get into it in more detail.
Okay.
But what we like to talk about is intimate, mutual, and pleasurable for both, which kind of sums up everything. If we think of sex as something which is supposed to be intimate,
Hmm.
so you truly do know each other. This is about you as individuals joining together, doing something that you each want to do. It's about connecting you. So it's not just using your spouse's body. It's
Hmm.
it's really about them. It's mutual in that both of you want to be doing this. You
Hmm.
both have libidos, you both are enjoying it, and it's pleasurable for both. And when we focus on those 3 things, and there's more things that go with it, but when you really focus on mutual, intimate, pleasurable for both, you get sex, which is great. And if I can show you what I mean by that, one of the reasons I think that people stress the obligation sex message so much is they're afraid that if we don't stress obligation, women aren't going to have sex. If we
Yeah.
don't tell them you have to do this, women aren't going to have sex. And I want to tell you the truth. Okay. Here's what we found. I'm going to list 5 things. So these aren't just 3 now. You got to remember 5, but it's interesting. All right. I'm going to list 5.
This is
So,
research based, everyone.
yes,
Yes.
when women frequently reach orgasm,
Hmm.
when there's high marital satisfaction, when
Hmm.
she feels emotionally close during sex,
Hmm.
when there's no porn use in the marriage, and when there's no sexual dysfunction, frequency pretty much takes care of itself. And the problem with evangelicalism is that we treat lack of frequency as a sex problem
Mm.
instead of saying, why aren't we having the kind of sex that they would both want?
Yeah.
Because women do want sex. Women do enjoy
Yes.
sex. And if
Yes.
women stop wanting sex, there's a reason. It doesn't always mean that there's a problem in the marriage. So maybe the reason that she doesn't feel emotionally close during sex is because she grew up reading all these crappy books that have given her these terrible messages. And so sex isn't something which can make her feel close.
Yeah.
And we talked to so many women in our focus groups who believed the obligation sex message. It was wrecking their sex lives, but their husbands didn't. Their husbands didn't want them to be having sex they didn't want to have. And when they finally sat down and had this out with their husbands, like things got a lot healthier and they found a lot of freedom. So I'm not trying to say that it's always his fault.
No.
But what I am trying to say is when she doesn't have a libido, our response to that should be curiosity, not condemnation.
Correct. And I'm so glad that you highlighted that you're not saying it's all his fault, because this is something
Mhm.
I've seen in watching some of your social media interactions, or actually other people's interactions with you on social media. That's actually more accurate there. There's a sense that, like, pushing back at all, giving men any sense of you have to do, the response is
Mhm.
always, well, what about the women? Well,
Yep.
you're just blaming guys. You're just blaming men. And I've always been both baffled and enraged by that response.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because as a marriage and family therapist, I can tell you that women bear the vast majority of the brunt of relational
Mhm.
reciprocity in so many cases. So it's so frustrating, because it feels like, because we had this power structure,
Mhm.
any little brick in the wall taken out feels like a threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we have a 47-point orgasm gap. Women have twice the rate of sexual pain. 50% of married evangelical men are using porn in some way. Like, yeah, guys, you might have to step up to the plate a little bit.
Yeah,
Orgasm is easier for men than it is for women. And so she is going to take extra care. But it doesn't mean that the problems are always with you. But I think for a man to be aware of all the negative messaging that his wife has probably heard her whole life. Even things like his needs, her needs, telling women that if you gain weight, it's like him living in a prison sentence, right? Like that you should weigh the same as when you were married and you should still look good. Like, I mean, that's a lot for women to have to bear. And
huge.
so I think men being aware that these are the messages that women have been given in
Hmm.
the church, in the place that's supposed to be their safe space. Yeah, just holding that can be so healing. And
Absolutely.
I honestly think a good guy can be one of the best healing things for women who are
Great
trying
word.
to deconstruct and reconstruct.
Yeah. Hmm. So, one of the other little conversational pins I stuck in there is about purity, because you mentioned that,
Hmm.
sex does need to be pure, and that is one of the seven P's in the book. But I wanted to ask us some specific questions about that because in the podcast, we are walking through the Old Testament and we're in Leviticus right now.
Okay.
And
Uh-huh.
we are talking a lot about purity. So, can you explain to us what purity actually is, first in the Old Testament and then also in the New Testament, and how they connect?
Yeah, I mean, purity in the Old Testament was largely ritualized.
Hmm.
It was a condition of whether or not you could come before God,
Hmm.
right?
Okay.
And there was this idea that God could only handle things without blemish, and it wasn't because God can't handle women who are menstruating. That wasn't that wasn't what it was about. It was
No.
really a ceremonial thing to tell us something about God's relationship with us. And I actually don't think the word purity is very helpful
Okay.
when we're talking about sex in today's context. I really think we like if we could bring back the word chastity and what it meant,
Mm,
but I think that word is so heavily laden too.
sure.
But I think that's a better word because the way that people think of purity right now is either you're pure or you're not.
Mm,
Um,
hmm.
and we see purity as being based on things that we have done in the past, and that's got nothing to do
Hmm.
with how God sees us.
Yes. Or
Um,
or that have been done to us.
exactly. So, the thought that being a virgin makes one pure. I mean, I know a lot of virgins who are not pure.
Hmm.
you know, like given what they're doing with their time, their money, their eyeballs, whatever. And yet I know a lot of single people who are not virgins who are very pure because of the way that they've chosen to live their lives today. And the whole point of Christianity is that we have a relationship with Jesus who makes us into a new creation and that
Hmm.
that 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 can be new every morning. And so this emphasis on the state of whether one is a virgin or not is just ridiculous because what does that do for sexual assault survivors? There's a chapter in one of the purity culture books when God writes your love story near the end of the book,
Hmm.
Eric and Leslie Luddy, and they're talking about the need for forgiveness and healing from shame. And in that chapter, they describe an 11-year-old being raped by a 16-year-old, and they describe a university aged couple having consensual sex, and they put them in the same category.
Okay.
And like those are not the same. Like it absolutely blows my mind
Yes.
that
And
they did that.
as someone who is a therapist who specializes primarily in trauma, I have sat
Mhm,
across from many sexual
mhm.
assault survivors, and hearing that is infuriating and disheartening.
Yeah. But at the same time, I also want to say, like, even that university aged couple who had consensual sex, they shouldn't be feeling all kinds of shame either. like, you can choose to live a different way starting
Hmm.
today.
Hmm.
It doesn't
Hmm.
define you. And the
Hmm.
problem with purity culture was that they made all of this define you.
Yes. I remember the analogy of a trash styrofoam cup being
Hmm.
used. I think that was
That
in
was Dana
the
Gresh. Yeah.
thank you. And I also remember hearing the analogy of like a piece of chewed up gum.
Yeah.
And all of those things were the messages that were told to women and men. Like, it's not
Mm.
just women. Like, this also affects men too, to say, when you give away a piece of your heart to somebody, you create, like,
Yeah.
soul tie, for
Yeah.
example, was another thing I heard,
Mhm.
with someone else. And now when you're giving yourself to your partner as a gift, which, let's talk about objectification, shall we?
Yes.
When you're giving yourself to your future partner as a gift, then you are only giving a piece of yourself, like
Mhm.
what's left.
Mhm.
And there was no sense of redemption. There was
No,
no sense of healing and recovery. And yeah.
that's right. Yeah. Yeah, and that's what we talked about a lot in our book She Deserves Better was how harmful all of this is. And chastity, the reason I like that better is
Hmm.
chastity can be a practice, right? Like it's not a
Mm.
state, it's a
Hmm.
practice. And
Hmm.
and chastity applies whether you're married or not. It's just simply taking your sexuality and holding it under Jesus' lordship, right? Like, hey, I'm going to honor God with my sexuality. And that
Good.
means that yeah, you might have a great sex life when you're married. It means that you're abstaining from objectifying others or participating
Hmm.
in human trafficking, which is what pornography is. Right,
Yes.
so we're not gonna
Yes.
oppress and hurt others. It means that when we're single, like, we're not gonna play with each other's hearts, we're not gonna string people along, even outside of the sexual realm, like, yeah, we're not gonna hurt other people, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and that's what we should be looking for, is just how are we treating one another? Are we being
Absolutely.
kind? Are we holding each other with dignity? Right? Like, yeah.
At the end of the day, it does seem not simple, but just fairly straightforward.
It boggles my mind that we
Yeah.
have messed it up so badly. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you discussed She Deserves Better. So I read them in the order of Great Sex Rescue first, and then She
Mhm.
Deserves Better. And it came at just the right time for me as my daughter was starting to turn into a non-toddler person,
Yes. Yes.
And I remember just reading that book and feeling a physical release in my
Mhm.
shoulders and in my chest,
Mhm.
because I remember thinking, reading The Great Sex Rescue, that, like, this is all great and I'm glad that we've got this, but I want to know, what do I do as a dad? And that's what I really like about the book. So can you kind of summarize some practical teaching targets for parents from that book?
Yeah, so what we did with She Deserves Better was we did a different study. So we surveyed
Okay.
7,000 women to find out about their experiences in church circles growing up. So, what they heard, what they were taught, what their parents' rules were around dating, like all of
Hmm.
that kind of thing. And then we saw how that affected them long term. And we thought that what we were writing was a book for parents of daughters. But I would say probably half the people who have read it are millennials who aren't even necessarily parents yet, but they're
Hmm.
they're reading it to reparent themselves because like this is what I should have heard at youth group, right? This is what I should have been told. This makes me feel so much better. So that was surprising to us, but kind of cool. Um, but what we're trying to do is we're working through all the really negative teachings that were given,
Hmm.
and then at the end of each chapter we have different activities you can do with your daughter. Um, yeah, conversations, checklists, etc.,
Hmm.
just to own it. And one of my favorite areas is talking about modesty, right? Because modesty is such a huge thing in youth group.
Okay.
And it's like, well, let's figure out how to talk to your daughter about what to wear, because choosing what to wear is an important thing, right? You don't
Hmm.
Nobody wants their daughter wearing like stripper clothes or something, right?
Hmm.
But like, how do you talk to her about that without equating it with causing a man to lust?
Right.
And so we take you through biblically what modesty actually means. It's not about not making men lust. It's about making people comfortable
Hmm.
and respecting others. That's what it was about in First Timothy 2. It
Hmm.
was about not dressing in such a way that you flaunt your wealth so that
Hmm.
people feel excluded. And
Hmm.
so if we're going to dress, we need to dress in such a way that we're respecting others, respecting ourselves, not excluding people. So we're not going to wear total brand names and advertise it. And that doesn't mean it doesn't mean you can't be flamboyant if that's your personality.
Sure.
But let's have those conversations, and we guide you through how to have a conversation with your daughter about this in a way that isn't shaming and that isn't
Yes.
talking to her about guys lust.
Yes. Hmm.
Because I think that's the problem, right? You grow up in this and you know what you don't want to do,
Yeah.
But then what, like, you also, so I don't want to give my kid hangups about sex, but I also don't want them having sex at 16. So how do we talk about this,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah.
Right. And that's why for me it was so powerful, was because it gave me a really good like framework of, okay, here's what
Hmm.
to do, not
Yeah.
just, what not to do. For me, it seemed as if there were kind of four broad categories that were really helpful for me to understand better, of like how to talk to your kids about
Hmm.
sex in a way that is not shaming.
Hmm.
That like that having the conversation around consent was really
Yeah.
important.
Hmm.
Having a conversation that was built around self-respect. So like the individual
Hmm.
child can be able to respect their own voice, their own needs, their own opinion, their own body, all those things.
Hmm.
And then also around discernment, that rather than almost like resisting that urge to go straight to like, what's the rule? What's the fence I can put around
Yes.
sexuality so
Yes.
that I can never have a problem. Instead of doing
Hmm.
that, trying to go, okay, this is complex and we need discernment.
Hmm.
And the last one being about boundaries, which is, as a
Yeah.
therapist, I love hearing about that. So
Yeah.
I kind of categorized it in those four like
Hmm.
domains. Is that pretty
Yeah,
accurate?
I think that's really good. Can I talk about two of them just
Yeah,
for a
please
sec?
go ahead.
So, the one about consent is just so important to me because that's never mentioned in purity culture books. It just isn't. And instead, women are basically blamed and little girls are blamed for so much of what happens. Like I said that Secret Keeper Girl made me cry, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
I want you to picture this. This is a curriculum written for girls ages 8 to 12 that mothers work through with their daughters.
So my daughter's
And
age.
hmm
Hmm.
and there's a picture of a little girl. She's got a headband in. She's wearing a striped t-shirt. She's still several years off of puberty.
Hmm.
She's barely got her adult teeth in. And she's raising her arms in the air and she's wearing a little striped t-shirt. And they're calling it the raise and praise test. So they tell little girls to put their arms in the air to make sure that their bellies don't show because bellies are intoxicating. And it goes on to explain how God made our bellies to be intoxicating. And what that means is that a man can get out of control. But God wants you only to intoxicate your husband.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so they literally told 8-year-old girls that the sight of their naked belly, the sight of their belly button, could cause an adult man to get out of control.
That's horrifying.
And the Secret Keeper Girl events were attended by 500,000 girls around North
Uh-huh.
America.
Uh-huh.
And they're still going on today. They've been rebranded as True Girl, but they're still going on today. And like that's unbelievable. But this is where consent was never mentioned.
Mhm.
It was just like, if someone assaults you, you probably did something wrong. So we need to be having those conversations. And I think one of the reasons consent was never mentioned was because, well, you're not supposed to be doing it anyway. So we don't need to talk about consent because you're not supposed to be having sex anyway.
Oh my gosh.
Um, and it just, we talked to so many women who didn't realize they had been date raped because they felt like, well, I started kissing
Right.
him. And, Shanti
Right.
Feldon in her book for young women only literally says, if you want to stop, it's safest to not even start.
Mm.
And so if you started, what did you expect? Right? Like,
Consent
mhm.
is reversible. You
Yeah,
can start
cons
and say no thank you.
exactly. Yeah.
Or
So
just a
that's
hard no. You don't have to be
yeah,
kind, just a hard no.
that's why consent matters. Discernment though is super interesting, and I want to talk to you about our findings on dating because I found this fascinating. So we asked our respondents both if they were allowed to date and if they did date in high school. So were they
Mm.
allowed to and did they?
Okay.
Um, and what we found was that every single one of those 4 different outcomes had some
Hmm.
positive outcomes and some negative ones, right?
Mm. Hmm.
So not being allowed to date, but dating meant you were more likely to get married if you consider that a positive outcome if you wanted to, because not getting married when you do want to, I think, is a negative outcome, right? So,
Hmm.
but you were also more likely to marry an abuser, than other people. So like everything had pros and cons. So the one with the most pros and the fewest cons was being allowed to date but choosing not to.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Your
But there's still
agency.
some, yeah, but there's still some cons, right? And what that
Yes.
shows you is that that's something that a parent can't control. Because telling a daughter you're allowed to date, but I don't want you to. Well,
Yeah.
that doesn't really work. So what you want to do is raise a daughter who has so much self-confidence
Mm.
that they are choosing for themselves what they're going to do, and they're recognizing that all the boys around them are silly. You know, which is what both my daughters did, which was great. But even they had crushes, like even they got
Mm.
their hearts broken.
Mhm.
But I just thought that was really interesting that we have tried to attack everything with rules,
Yes.
and what rules don't actually work. Helping your daughter to get internal self-esteem, internal sense of worth and confidence and identity is what actually leads to the best outcomes long term.
Absolutely. Okay. Speaking of discernment, and I'm so glad you highlighted that because there's one thing that you have said a few times in both your books and some appearances where you talk about like, trusting your instincts, trusting your heart. And that is something that I imagine some people would struggle with because I know I myself was always told like the heart is desperately wicked and who can ever understand it? And you can't trust your emotions because your emotions will lie to you, all those sorts of messages. And I'm trying to understand the proper space in between realizing that there is just a kernel of truth in some of those messages.
Mhm.
And then also at the same time, realizing that when our body is uncomfortable, that is valuable information we should not overlook.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is hard because a lot of these teachings got big because there are kernels of truth to them,
Hmm.
right? Even the idea that lust is every man's battle.
Hmm.
Okay?
Hmm.
The way that it is taught is very harmful. But there also is an underlying truth, and that many people do struggle with objectification and lust. I would argue that it's not only men, that it can also
Right.
be women, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But yeah, there is some truth there, right? And so this is where I think if we have the central grounding principle that what God wants for us is intimacy
Hmm.
with one another. And intimacy relies on being authentic. It relies on being vulnerable.
Hmm.
It relies on being truthful, and that we cannot be vulnerable or authentic when we're not in a safe relationship or safe space,
Yes.
right?
Hmm.
If those are our underlying motivations,
Hmm.
and intimacy, I don't necessarily mean sexual intimacy with a
Hmm.
with a spouse, but even intimacy
Hmm.
among friends,
Hmm.
intimacy, we want
Hmm.
real relationships, right? We don't want superficial
Hmm.
things.
Being seen,
Then a lot of
heard.
this stuff starts to make more sense.
Hmm.
Because if you think about the every man's battle message, we'll just get back to that again. If our goal is intimacy with one another, then we just simply can't objectify people. So if you're aiming for intimacy in the way that God created us for intimacy, we want intimacy with God, but we also want intimacy with each other, then I need to do what I can to not objectify others so that I can get to know them better and so that I can treat them with dignity and respect. Right. And that may mean that if I'm having a difficult time with that, that's a sign that I need to get something right in my orientation towards, my own sexuality, towards the opposite sex, the opposite, whatever, that gender, whatever it might be. But I think just getting the right orientation towards each other, towards our relationships, towards sex, and having that orientation be, this honestly life-giving intimacy that I think God wants for us in every relationship can help clarify these things,
Hmm.
right? It clarifies what do we want from our dating relationship, and teaching our kids to have that too. I think is really important as well.
Yes. Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much for covering all those things because I want to make sure that we're not just talking up in the ether about ideas. We're really going down to what can I do in my own relationship to sex and sexuality, in my own marriage, in as a parent, all those things like what can I do? So I wanted to finish up here today because one of the things that I work with is primarily people who have experienced spiritual trauma,
Hmm.
especially through the institutional church. And so one of the things that you have talked about is like the some of the signs of toxic church environments, because the things you've been talking about so far are not just like an isolated bad apple here, there, there. Like this is endemic and
Yeah.
systemic.
Yeah.
So what do we do about that?
Yeah. A lot of what we look at specifically is the objectification of women and the push for male hierarchy. I think that male hierarchy is the big underlying issue
Okay.
that is hurting the evangelical church. And male hierarchy is linked to a very unchristlike view of power
Mm.
and
Mm-hmm.
empire,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like Jesus said, look, it's the Romans, it's the pagans who worry about power and authority and how to exercise authority, and that's not supposed to be that way with you.
Right.
And he talks about how he came to serve, not to be served.
Mm-hmm.
And yet what we have done in the evangelical church is we have created a whole system where it is largely based on power,
Yeah.
on on a pastor having power over his congregation, and then the overlying and the underlying, whatever word you want to use, ethos is we cannot criticize the pastor. You can't speak ill of God's anointed. You can't go against the pastor.
Okay.
We can't go against our small group leaders. And so there's this big
Mm-hmm.
hierarchy that is made within the church, and male hierarchy is a huge part of that. And whenever
Yes.
we do that, we get distortions in relationships. We
Okay.
create vulnerability. And whenever you have vulnerability combined with power, you're going to get abuse.
Every
You
time.
just are.
Yep.
And that abuse isn't necessarily, I don't just mean you're going to get pastors abusing teenagers, although you very well could. But you can just see it in spiritual abuse and how
Mm-hmm.
people are trying to control others using spiritual guilt, spiritual manipulation, etc. And so, I think one of the big signs of whether you are in a healthy church, a healthy spiritual space is there accountability for those at the top?
Yes.
Obviously in any organization, we're probably going to have a leader, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have, most churches are going to have a pastor, but does that pastor have accountability? Is there do you have a way to tell the pastor, hey, I don't agree with that without getting into trouble?
Mm-hmm.
Is the church oriented around protecting the pastor, or is the church
Mm-hmm.
oriented around protecting people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
And
that's the difference between real accountability and like just pro forma accountability.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think a lot of these really toxic teachings that have come through because evangelicalism has is so wedded to the idea that men matter more than women do.
Mm-hmm.
And so women are here and women exist to serve men. And um that's just not, it's just not of Jesus. It just
No.
isn't. And
No.
what bothers me is that when you actually look at surveys of people who are currently in evangelical churches, more people believe like us than believe like them, but they are still in those pews because they think there's no other place to find Jesus. And if all of
Right.
those people just started talking to each other and realized, oh, hey, we don't agree with this, let's just leave and form our own thing. Or go to that little Lutheran church down the street that only has 50 people and they're all old. But hey, we can go and we can revive that church, with all these lovely old ladies who would love to serve in Sunday school. They'd be so thrilled if some kids came or something, right? Like I just think that we need to be proactive, because so often the way that we see was, well, I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
leave the church because my support system is there.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, this is a systemic problem, and
Mm-hmm.
it needs a systemic solution. And the more each of us individually keep supporting a system which is bad, the more that system's going to stay there.
Without a doubt. Yes. And that is part of what we kind of run into when we're trying to find our community, find our people, but then
Mhm.
we encounter all these like toxic teachings, and especially like as parents, sometimes we don't always know what they're
Mhm.
teaching in the youth group or
Yeah.
in the children's church or whatever. And so I'm just trying to understand, how should we as parents handle that?
Mhm. Um, you just remember that youth group is always going to be the most toxic place of any church.
Hmm.
It just
Okay.
always is. Um, Uh, so you may go to a church and they may never say anything about every man's battle, or they may never have any talks about sex. And so you may think, well, this church doesn't teach anything weird about sex. But chances are in youth group, that's like 50% of what they're talking about. And so if they're going to talk about anything weird, it's going to be in youth group.
Yeah.
And so we have to be really, really, really careful.
Okay.
And what we found in She Deserves Better is that, religion is good for you. Believing in Jesus is good for you. Going to church is good for you. But as soon as girls internalize the toxic stuff, it actually would have been better for them if they had never gone to church at all.
Hmm.
And a lot of us choose churches because they have really flashy youth groups.
Mm-hmm.
And we think, well, our kids just really need good friends.
Hmm.
But ultimately, it doesn't end up working that way. What your kids need is a safe
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
And often those youth groups aren't safe. And so, churches that have male-only leadership are far more likely to have toxic teachings. We had a paper published recently in the Journal of Scientific Study of Religion looking at
Okay.
this about modesty. And basically, youth groups that teach modesty messages, girls are far more likely to be sexually abused there by their peers. By pastors as well, but also by their peers, which means that when boys go to those youth groups, they are being conditioned to sexually abuse as well. Like if they had been in a different youth group, they probably wouldn't have done that.
Right. And I just want to be clear about what you're saying to everybody who might be listening, that like this is not necessarily about a causal connection of 100%. That every single time every person receives this, that they will turn into an abuser.
Oh no! It's just,
Oh,
when I say more likely, like it might
yes,
go from 10% to 15%, but it's still
correct.
more likely.
Yes, yeah, and
Mhm.
within the realm of statistical significance, there, like this is
Yeah.
not just like a little blip. This is a
Mhm.
thing that, compared to other groups, we see a noticeable, sharp distinction between the
Yeah.
two. Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
and so I just know that like there's some really superficial objections that I sometimes hear about, like, oh, you're saying everybody who gets this is an abuser. It's like absolutely not. But
No.
we are saying that there is a much higher incidence,
Yeah.
noticeably, significantly higher incidence.
Yeah, and the other thing we found is like, okay, so 50% of married evangelical men use porn. Okay,
Mm,
that's a finding
mm.
that we have. We haven't studied this, so what I'm about to tell you is this is Sheila's hypothesis. I don't have actual backing for this one, okay? But
Thank
I've
you.
done enough focus groups that I think this is true, and I would love
Fair
to do
enough.
some more research on it. But
Ooh,
when I say that 50% of married evangelical men use porn, that doesn't mean that 50% of men in every church use porn.
okay.
My guess is that there's some churches where it's 80% and there's some where it's 20%.
Mm,
Because there are some
good point.
churches that so normalize porn use and talk about every man's battle and objectify women and have the Billy Graham rule going, and women are seen as threats, where porn is probably ubiquitous, like everyone's probably using it. And then there's some churches where they just don't even talk about it. It's like
Yeah.
not even a big deal because everyone treats each other like brothers and sisters in Christ, and we all get together, and we're all in this mission together, and we're all trying to serve the community, and we're Jesus focused. And I'm sure that the number is closer to 20%. And so when I hear people saying, I was so traumatized in my church because every guy used porn and I was treated like an object and I was respected so much better outside of the church. It's like, yeah, you're probably in an 80% church. You need to get in a different church, hon. Like,
Right.
like,
Right.
yeah, because these things travel in pockets.
Yes.
Because one of the big findings that we have, like overall, our big picture thing is that the teachings affect behavior and outcome. The
Yep.
teachings matter. And so
Yep.
when teachings objectify and when teachings allow male entitlement, we are going to see more negative outcomes.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I feel like we've covered a whole lot of ground, and I
Mhm.
really appreciate your time. I know that you have given a lot of your time, and I sincerely appreciate that. Can you go ahead and give us some information about where people can find your content and find more information about the stuff we've talked about today?
Sure. So my website is baremarriage.com. So that's BARE. And when you go there, we've got all our books. Our three big ones are Great Sex Rescue, She Deserves Better, and our new book, The Marriage You Want. But we've got lots of other things there. I've got an orgasm course. I have a course for teaching your kids about puberty and sex to do it in a
Hmm,
non-shaming way as well. So you can
great.
check that out under courses. But that's baremarriage.com. Also have all my social media links. I do fun things on Instagram, like I fixed terrible quotes from people and lots of fun stuff
Oh,
like that.
yes. Yeah.
So
I've
you
seen
can
that.
see that. And then we also have the Bare Marriage podcast every Thursday. So
Okay.
yeah, you can subscribe to that too.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Sheila. I really, really appreciate this. This is in many ways, I don't want to quite say dream come true, but definitely you've been on my wish list ever since I
Oh,
started.
good.
Yeah. So,
Thanks, Spencer.
so I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. On YouTube and X, you can find me at Church Kid Pod, and on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. If you find this content either enjoyable or important, please hit the like button and/or subscribe on whatever platform you listen to. Of course, ratings, reviews, and sharing with others is the best way to increase visibility and ensure that more people hear or see this content. If you have questions or want to engage in dialogue, leave a comment on that platform. Alternatively, you can leave a voice message on SpeakPipe, and I will add it to the Q&R episodes at the end of the season. Finally, just one last word to everyone. I don't know your story, but I know the one who is walking with you in your story. I know that he loves you. He made you for a purpose, and that his plan for you is always better. If you have been hurt by the church, I am sorry for the ways in which we have borne the name in vain. That is our responsibility to repair and repent. I hope that this podcast starts you on your own journey to find resurrection on the other side of deconstruction. My prayer for you is the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.